was sold like property, for 2 blankets. But when their eyes met, something changed. What began as a forced trade on a dusty frontier post turns into something neither of them expected. You won't believe what happens next in this powerful and emotional journey through pain, resilience, and hope. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the small settlement near the Red River, where dust swirled in lazy circles between the weathered wooden structures that formed the trading post. It was the autumn of 1862, and the frontier was a place where desperation often trumped decency, where survival meant making choices that would haunt a person for the rest of their days. Among the ramshackle buildings, a young woman named Emma Caldwell stood with her head bowed, her long auburn hair falling across her face like a veil meant to hide her shame and fear. Emma was 17 years old, with pale skin that burned easily under the relentless sun and green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of a different life. Those dreams had died slowly over the past 3 years, ever since her father had been killed in a skirmish with raiders, and her mother had remarried a man named Chester Graves, a bitter drunk who saw Emma as nothing more than another mouth to feed. Her stepfather stood beside her now, his weathered hand gripping her arm with bruising force, while her mother looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her daughter's pleading gaze. Across from them stood a young Comanche warrior named Takota, whose name meant friend to all in his language, though he felt anything but friendly in this moment. He was perhaps 19 years old, tall and lean with strong shoulders and arms that spoke of years spent riding and hunting across the vast plains. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, and his long black hair was adorned with a single eagle feather that marked him as a skilled hunter. Despite his youth, there was a gravity to his presence, a weight of sorrow that seemed to hang around him like morning mist. Takota had not wanted to come to this trading post, had not wanted to participate in this degrading transaction, but his father, the war chief of his band, had insisted. His father believed that taking a white captive would bring prestige and demonstrate their strength to the other bands, but Takota knew the truth was far more personal and painful. His father was trying to replace what had been lost, trying to fill the void left by Takota's younger sister, who had died from fever the previous winter. The grief had driven his father to desperate measures, and Takota, as the dutiful son, had been sent to complete this terrible bargain. The trader, a grizzled man named Polk who profited from human misery without a shred of conscience, stood between the two parties and cleared his throat. His voice was rough as gravel when he spoke, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the group like a heavy blanket. The words he spoke were businesslike and cold, as if he were discussing the trade of horses or cattle rather than a human life. Chester Graves pushed Emma forward slightly and she stumbled, catching herself before she fell. Her hands were trembling, and she kept them clasped together tightly, her knuckles white with the pressure. She could feel the weight of multiple gazes upon her, assessing her worth as if she were livestock at auction. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun on her shoulders, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she fought them back with the last shreds of her dignity. Takota's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He had brought 2 fine blankets as his father had instructed, blankets woven with intricate patterns that represented months of skilled work. The blankets lay folded across his arms, and the weight of them felt like the weight of his own compromised honor. He had always believed himself to be a man of principle, someone who fought only to protect his people and their way of life. But here he was, participating in something that felt fundamentally wrong, something that violated the very core of who he wanted to be. Emma finally lifted her head and met Takota's eyes for the first time. What she saw there surprised her. She had expected cruelty, perhaps hunger or violence, but instead she saw conflict and something that might have been regret. His expression was carefully controlled, but his eyes betrayed him, revealing a young man who was as trapped by circumstance as she was, though in a different way. For a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 young people caught in a situation neither had chosen, both silently wondering how their lives had led them to this moment. Chester broke the spell with his harsh voice, demanding that the trade be completed quickly. He spoke of needing to get back before nightfall, as if he had somewhere important to be, as if selling his stepdaughter were just another errand to be checked off his list. Emma's mother let out a small sob but still refused to look at her daughter, her shoulders shaking with either grief or guilt, perhaps both. Dakota stepped forward and held out the blankets. His movements were deliberate and slow, and when Chester reached for them, Dakota pulled them back slightly and spoke for the first time. His English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. He addressed not Chester but Emma directly, his voice lower and gentler than she had expected. He told her that he did not wish to harm her, that she would be treated with respect in his camp. He explained that his people had suffered greatly, that they were struggling to maintain their way of life against forces that seemed determined to destroy them, but that did not excuse what was happening here today. He wanted her to know that he saw her as a person, not as property, and that he would do what he could to make her situation bearable. The words were formal and stiff, clearly difficult for him to say, but they were sincere. Emma blinked in surprise, uncertain how to respond. She had expected silence or commands, not this strange attempt at reassurance from someone who was essentially purchasing her like goods from a store. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she possibly say in response to such a statement? Thank you for promising not to harm me while you take me away from everything I know. The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. Chester, impatient and eager to be done with the whole affair, snatched the blankets from Dakota's hands and shoved Emma toward the young Comanche warrior. She stumbled again, and this time Dakota reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her arm, a stark contrast to the bruising grip her stepfather had maintained all morning. The touch was brief, but it sent a shock through Emma's system, a reminder that she was about to leave with this stranger, to enter a world completely foreign to everything she had known. Her mother finally looked up, tears streaming down her weathered face, and whispered a trembling goodbye that was barely audible over the wind. Emma wanted to scream at her, to demand how she could allow this to happen, how she could choose a man like Chester over her own daughter, but the words stuck in her throat, choked by emotion and the terrible understanding that nothing she said would change anything now. The decision had been made, the transaction completed, and her old life was already slipping away like sand through her fingers. Dakota gently guided Emma toward his horse, a beautiful painted mare that stood patiently nearby. He helped her onto the horse with careful hands, then mounted behind her. Emma sat rigid, her back straight and unyielding, refusing to lean against him despite the practical necessity of the riding arrangement. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing behind her, could sense the controlled strength in his body, and it terrified her, even as some small part of her recognized that he had treated her with more consideration in these few minutes than her stepfather had shown in 3 years. As they began to ride away from the trading post, Emma allowed herself one final look back. She saw her mother collapsed against Chester, who was already examining the blankets with a satisfied expression. She saw Polk counting his commission with greedy fingers. She saw the small settlement that had been her prison for the past 3 years growing smaller in the distance. And she realized with a strange mixture of terror and relief that she was leaving behind everything familiar, even if that familiarity had been painful, and riding into complete uncertainty. The landscape opened up before them as they rode, vast stretches of grassland dotted with occasional clusters of trees. The sky seemed impossibly large, stretching from horizon to horizon in a dome of brilliant blue. Emma had rarely traveled far from the settlement, and the sheer scale of the wilderness both awed and frightened her. She wondered where they were going, how far they would travel, what awaited her at the end of this journey. Dakota rode in silence for a long time, allowing both of them to process what had just occurred. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, he spoke again. His voice came from behind her, quiet but clear, and she had to strain slightly to hear his words over the sound of the horse's hooves and the wind in the grass. He told her his name and explained what it meant. He told her that his camp was still 2 days' ride to the north, that they would stop soon to make camp for the night, and that he would ensure her safety. He spoke of his people's customs, trying to prepare her for what she would encounter, explaining that she would be expected to work and contribute to the community, but that she would not be mistreated. His tone was matter of fact, almost like a teacher instructing a student. and Emma found herself listening despite her fear and resentment. When he finished speaking, silence settled between them again, but it felt different now, less hostile and more contemplative. Emma's mind raced with questions she was not yet brave enough to ask. Why had he agreed to this trade if he seemed so uncomfortable with it? What had he meant when he spoke of his people's suffering? What would become of her in this new life that had been forced upon her? And perhaps most confusing of all, why did his gentleness make her feel even more lost and uncertain than cruelty would have? As the sun touched the horizon, Dakota guided his horse toward a small grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and Emma felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease slightly. Dakota dismounted first, then helped her down with the same careful consideration he had shown before. Their eyes met again as her feet touched the ground, and Emma saw something in his gaze that she had not expected to find there, something that looked almost like understanding, as if he too knew what it meant to have your life determined by forces beyond your control, to be trapped between duty and desire, between what was expected and what felt right. The first night under the vast Texas sky was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Dakota had built a small fire with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise as he gathered dried wood and arranged it carefully. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the serious set of his mouth. Emma sat on the opposite side of the fire, hugging her knees to her chest, watching him with a mixture of wariness and reluctant curiosity. He had given her a portion of dried meat and some kind of bread made from ground seeds that she did not recognize. The food was foreign to her palate, but her hunger overcame her hesitation, and she ate slowly, acutely aware of his presence across the flames. Dakota ate his own portion in silence, his gaze occasionally drifting to her face before looking away again, as if he too was uncertain how to navigate this strange and uncomfortable situation they found themselves in. When the meal was finished, Dakota spread out a blanket near the fire and gestured for Emma to take it. She hesitated, confusion evident in her expression, until she realized he intended for her to sleep there while he kept watch. The gesture surprised her, this small kindness from someone who had every right to treat her as property, as something he had purchased with 2 blankets at a dusty trading post. She settled onto the blanket without a word, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders against the cooling night air. Sleep did not come easily. Emma lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the rustling of grass in the wind, the distant call of night birds, the crackling of the fire. She thought about her mother's tear-stained face, about Chester's satisfied smirk, about the life she had left behind. But mostly she thought about the young man sitting across the fire, this Dakota, whose name meant friend to all, and wondered what twist of fate had brought them together in such a terrible way. Dakota, for his part, sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, his rifle across his lap, keeping watch through the long hours of darkness. His thoughts were equally troubled. He had seen the fear in Emma's eyes, the humiliation, the profound sense of betrayal, and it stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He thought of his sister, little Dove, who had been so full of life and laughter before the fever took her. His father believed that bringing a captive into their family would ease the pain of her loss, but Dakota knew better. Nothing could replace little Dove, and trying to do so only compounded the tragedy. As dawn broke across the plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and lavender, Dakota finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a brief rest. Emma woke to find him sleeping, sitting up, his head tilted back against the tree trunk, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. She studied him in the early morning light, this stranger who held her fate in his hands, and felt a confusing tangle of emotions she could not quite name. They rode throughout the second day, covering vast distances across the rolling grasslands. Dakota pointed out landmarks and shared small pieces of knowledge about the land, the best places to find water, which plants were edible, how to read the weather and the behavior of animals. Emma listened, absorbing the information despite herself, recognizing that survival in this new world would require her to learn everything she could. As they rode, Dakota began to speak more freely, perhaps finding it easier to share his thoughts when he did not have to look directly at her. He told her about his childhood, about learning to ride and hunt with his father and uncles, about the vast buffalo herds that had once covered the plains like a living carpet. His voice carried a deep sadness when he spoke of how much had changed in recent years, how the white settlers had pushed further and further into Comanche territory, how the buffalo were disappearing, how his people were being forced to choose between their way of life and survival itself. Emma found herself responding, asking questions, engaging in conversation despite her intention to remain silent and withdrawn. She asked about his family, about the camp they were traveling to, about what would be expected of her. Dakota answered honestly, explaining that his mother had died when he was young, that his father was a respected war chief but had become harder and more bitter since Little Dove's death, that the camp consisted of about 40 people, families who had chosen to resist the pressure to move on to the reservation. He explained that Emma would likely be assigned to work with the women, learning to tan hides, prepare food, and maintain the camp. He promised again that he would not allow anyone to harm her, and this time Emma heard the determination in his voice, the quiet strength that suggested he meant what he said. She wanted to hate him, wanted to maintain her anger and resentment, but it was becoming increasingly difficult when he treated her with such unexpected consideration and respect. That evening, they made camp beside a clear stream that wound through a small valley. The landscape here was more varied, with clusters of oak trees providing shade and shelter. Dakota caught several fish from the stream, using a method Emma had never seen before, his hands moving with swift precision in the water. He showed her how to prepare them for cooking, his hands guiding hers patiently when she struggled with the unfamiliar task. As they worked together, their hands occasionally touching, Emma became acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his body beside hers, of the gentle patience in his voice as he instructed her. She felt her cheeks flush and was grateful for the fading light that hid her reaction. Dakota seemed equally affected, his movements becoming slightly awkward, his explanations trailing off mid-sentence before he cleared his throat and continued. After they ate, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dakota did something unexpected. He began to tell Emma about Little Dove, his voice soft and filled with grief. He described his sister's laugh, bright as morning bird song, her skill with beadwork, her kindness to everyone she met. He explained how her death had devastated their father, how grief had transformed him from a wise and compassionate leader into someone driven by anger and the need to demonstrate strength and control. Emma listened, and as she listened, she began to understand. She saw that Dakota was as much a victim of circumstance as she was, caught between his duty to his father and his own sense of right and wrong. She recognized the weight he carried, the burden of being a good son while maintaining his own integrity. And in that recognition, something shifted between them, a subtle change in the air, a lowering of walls that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. She found herself sharing her own story, telling him about her father's death, about her mother's weakness, about Chester's cruelty, and the 3 years of living in fear and hunger. The words poured out of her, things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, and Dakota listened with the same quiet attention she had given him. When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort. Instead, he simply acknowledged her pain with a solemn nod, his eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond words. They sat together in companionable silence as the fire burned low, both of them lost in their own thoughts, but somehow connected by their shared confessions, by the recognition that they were both trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break them. Emma felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of anger and fear beginning to unravel, replaced by something she could not quite identify, but that felt almost like hope. On the 3rd day of their journey, they finally approached Dakota's camp. Emma's nervousness returned in full force as she saw the circle of buffalo hide teepees arranged near a bend in a river. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear the sounds of children playing, women calling to one another, the general bustle of daily life. Dakota felt her tense against him and spoke quietly, reassuring her once more that he would protect her, that she had nothing to fear. As they rode into the camp, people stopped their activities to watch. Emma felt dozens of eyes upon her, assessing, judging, curious. Dakota guided his horse directly to the largest teepee, where an older man emerged, his face marked by time and grief, his bearing proud and unyielding. This was clearly Dakota's father, the war chief, and Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she realized that her fate would ultimately be decided by this stern-faced man. The chief spoke in Comanche, his voice sharp and demanding. Dakota responded calmly, dismounting and then helping Emma down. He kept himself positioned slightly between her and his father, a subtle but deliberate gesture of protection. The conversation